Good morning, everyone. I invite Diana and Adam to the stage to please join me. Good morning. Yes, I realize we're just before the coffee break, but I hope you will bear with me nevertheless. So as we already heard a few times over the course of yesterday and this morning, regulation and policy deeply affects how financial institutions operate, and it also affects their willingness and ability to align their financial flows with sustainability goals and global sustainability agendas. The UNEP-FI Green Finance Measures database now records almost 800 policy and regulation measures in over 100 countries. And we want to dive deeper in this session this morning to discuss specifically the banking regulatory framework and what this means for banks in the Asia-Pacific region. It will come as no surprise, of course, to this audience that it's been recognized all over the world that climate change poses material risks to financial institutions. And so we see a large number of central banks and supervisors in the region having taken initial and to some extent also further developed steps to address these by mandating climate-related disclosures, by experimenting with scenario analysis and stress tests in their markets. And yet we also see that progress is somewhat uneven across the region. So we want to explore where does this leave banking institutions and what could be some of the steps to address the current challenges. So I'm very pleased to have these two distinguished panelists with me that I want to briefly introduce to you. Ladies first, I guess. We have Diana Parusheva-Lowry with us, the Executive Director for Public Policy and Sustainable Finance at ASIFMA, the Asia Securities Industry and Financial Market Association. Diana is a lawyer by training who has 20 years of experience in central banking, government, the private sector, mostly focusing on decarbonization and sustainable finance. I'm very happy to have you here. And I'm also joined by Adam Ng, the Asia Pacific lead for Greening Financial Regulation Initiative and WWF, and also a sustainable finance advisor for WWF Malaysia. He has a graduate degree and postdoc from Oxford University and has also worked in academia, research, and liquidity management. So very happy to have you both here. My first question will be to you, Adam. WWF regularly publishes the results of its SASREG analysis covering sustainable finance policy measures globally, but also, of course, for the Asia-Pacific region. And you've recently written about your observed a mismatch between countries' physical vulnerability to climate change and also the regulatory responses that countries have taken. So I wanted to get your view on what regulators in the region should do to address this and your general picture of the state of banking regulation in the region.
Hello everyone, Kamsahamnida. Thank you, Laura. Hope you can hear me well. First of all, thank you so much for for inviting us. WWF and UNEP-FI, we have long-standing collaboration and initiative. And it is also very interesting to note that it's not just WWF having the Sustainable Central Banking Financial Supervisory Assessment Tool, but a lot of other organizations, right? I think the one that Laura just mentioned in terms of the database that UNEP-FI has, in fact, Green Central Banking and a few other organizations are already tracking the performance and practices of regulators. So it's not just the banking industry, the insurance industry that are being tracked or assessed by rating agency and so on, but also I think regulators are now being kept track as well. So coming back to your point, yes, indeed there is a mismatch, but you can see as from two sides of the coin. The first mismatch could be seen as, from our assessment, only about 50% of the climate indicators that we have are being fulfilled fully by central banks and financial supervisors. So we have about 80 over assessment indicators that looks into both climate, nature, but also social. And the assessment looks into different functionality of the central banking, primarily monetary policy, but also on financial supervisory frameworks, particularly on prudential regulation. And the third functionality is enabling environment, that we look into the general enablers such as carbon pricing, carbon tax, national level taxonomy, or corporate disclosure requirements by the stock exchange, and so on. So when we mention 50%, I think I think it's subjective. It depends how you look at it. But the central banking and regulators' involvement in green financial kind of initiative is still relatively new, and we can use maybe the initial point of the NGFS establishment, but probably about 5 years ago, as the if you look at a child, right, the NGFS is only 5 years old, right, and it takes a few more years to reach adulthood and so on. So achieving 50%, I think that is relatively a promising number. But having said that, as a science-based civil society organization, we will continuously improve and strengthen the assessment indicators and make it more stringent, and also evolve at the same time. Maybe I go a bit deep dive into what aspect that's still missing in terms of supervisory expectation. So there's a lot of supervisory expectation on the governance and overall strategy and overall risk management that has to be done by the banking institutions. But what is slightly lacking is more on the processes, portfolio risks and impact, and also capital and liquidity standards. Of course, the last part on capital liquidity standards is always a tricky point, because the BIS hasn't embarked on a firm footing when it comes to capital liquidity risk management and risk weight and so on. The other aspect that is still also missing is pretty much the macro-prudential aspect, which is basically systemic risk. So not many regulators have imposed or set guidelines or limits when it comes to macro-prudential systemic risks. And this probably is a bit difficult because we haven't in our lifetime seen systemic risks like the COVID. But if you treat COVID as something of a potential equivalence to climate, then yes, COVID was a systemically important problem. Right? Yeah, maybe I'll stop there and then continue.
Thank you. Already a few points for me to pick up from there, but I first wanted to hand it over to Diana. Does that observation broadly line with your perception of the state of play? And specifically, if you could maybe touch on the balance between voluntary action and regulatory action, how you see that play out in different jurisdictions in the region.
Yes, thank you, Laura, and thank you, everybody. It's a great privilege to be among you. Broadly, I think 50% is half glass full or half glass empty, so it depends whether you're going to be the optimist or the pessimist. I prefer to be the optimist and see things like progressing quite quickly, actually, and I'm really pleased and encouraged by your finding. And I have to admit I haven't read your report, but we discussed before this panel that it's very useful and helpful to have it, and I'll definitely have a look. I think a lot of things have happened in the past 2 years in terms of climate risk and how we address it. Both at global level, the Banking Commission for the Basel Commission for Banking Supervision came up with some principles of how we address and we should think about climate risk. A lot of the central banks across Europe, America, and here in Asia have done their thinking or are doing their thinking. As you mentioned, many of the jurisdictions have already had some scenario and climate risk stress testings. A lot of them are preparing for a second round, and we have to acknowledge that climate risk, it is a different risk, and we're still kind of trying to understand how to assess it, how to measure it, what methodologies to use, whether climate risk can be just put into the existing metrics that we have that address other risks at the market, or whether this is a new type of risk that requires further thinking. Yet these exercises that have all been pilots and have been own kind of either taking a few banks from certain jurisdiction or measuring only certain aspects, just because the regulators are still struggling to understand exactly the nature of the beast. And there is another thing which I think applies to Asia very much. We do know that there are scenarios that have been used broadly across the globe, but when it comes to Asia, actually the detailed physical or transition scenarios are not there yet. So it's very difficult for Central Bank of Malaysia, for example, or Brunei or Laos, or even the biggest countries like India and China to actually go to the level of detail that will allow you to measure properly the risk. And although a lot has been done, I think we are at the beginning of the journey and there is a lot yet to understand. With respect to your question of balance between voluntary and public action, I think we've seen a little bit of both. I mean, central banks are definitely now being tasked to consider climate risk, and they're trying the existing tools that they have in their portfolio in order to manage this risk. But also, of course, every bank is now fully aware of the risks and opportunities that climate will present to them. So a CIFMA represents mostly multinational banks. So our kind of perspective is even more complex and perhaps useful, but slightly distinct, because we observe the cross-border and the multi-jurisdictional kind of assessment of portfolios and risks. And this is different from if you are a local bank that operates just in one jurisdiction. And regulators are aware of this difference. And we have to face the fact that every national central bank or regulator first and foremost has the obligation to monitor and manage the country-specific risk, and then think about the global risks and the risk for the global system. So again, back to the original kind of observation that climate risk is a global phenomenon, and we're asking different jurisdictions to address it at local level sufficiently adequately, but also bearing in mind that they're part of the big structure and the big system. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So maybe just to follow up on that, beyond this challenge that you highlighted of the local and the global, in managing climate risks, and let's stay with climate for now, what other challenges do your members bring to you, and how would you say do they prepare for this upcoming regulation?
Well, the challenges, I think, we're more aware of the challenges than of the solutions right now, but that's a very useful full step to understand where you are. And it won't be a surprise to anyone to say that data and the availability of information is a key challenge. And again, talking from a perspective of a multinational institution, being financial or any other, when you have to compare data and circumstances coming from different jurisdictions, you need to have some common denominator in order to be able to put this into one piece and make proper comparison. And this is still a challenge. We have discussed yesterday and I think today disclosure and data have been mentioned, and one of the previous panelists is representing this kind of public data gathering utility, and a lot of initiatives have happened in this respect. However, there is still a lack of available data. Scope 1 and 2, we probably can say that we can have a proper handle on this, but scope 3 is pretty much in the making, and this is going to be very difficult. So for everybody, not only the financial institutions, but the regulators as well, is the first prerequisite of proper assessment is to have actually the relevant information that comes in the form of comparable data. So that's one thing that I think we still haven't overcome, although I think each one of us is completely aware of it, and a lot of initiatives and a lot of effort has gone into this. And I'll just share anecdotal evidence that came from my colleagues in Australia when Australia was discussing their disclosure requirements and how they have to mandate who should disclose and gather what sort of data. They did some of back of the envelope calculation, and I don't want to mention the number that they came up with, but I can tell you it's a substantial number. So all these things do have monetary implications, and we have to acknowledge them. And we are still talking about listed companies, the mega companies, which can probably afford to bear these costs. But when it comes to SMEs, and especially in places like Asia, where you have economies which are so diverse, and we ask them to collect the same amount and the same detail of data, which is going to cost them, we have to acknowledge the challenges that people might face.
Yeah, very important point. And I think, yeah, the data challenge is probably the unifying point that will come up in most panels over these few days. Adam, you mentioned that macroprudential regulation is one of the areas where you still see some scope for this being developed further in the region, and clearly scenario analysis and stress testing would be part of that. I would be interested to get your view on what you consider the role of central banks and supervisors to be in encouraging the broader transition of the real economy, and what role other potential tools and methodologies in the toolbox of central banks might be in encouraging that, specifically thinking of transition plans, for example. Would be great to get your views on that.
Yeah, thanks. So I can give some example from the jurisdiction that I work closely with. So as you mentioned, there are a few tools or ways in which the alignment between the financial sector and the real economy could be strengthened. In some jurisdiction, we are seeing that the taxonomy is being issued by the financial regulator, or at least spearheaded by the financial regulator. But there are some jurisdictions where it's more at the national level, where it is government driven, of course with consultation with various stakeholders. I think ultimately taxonomy should be a kind of standard. It's like I think on Tuesday when we had the energy efficiency workshop, that building codes should be made readily available, and it's not really a financial sector kind of domain. Rather, it is a housing market that everyone should have access to such information. So the same thing with taxonomy. Taxonomy should be applicable and applied to all corporate economy, regardless of location and also the size. Of course, for smaller institutions like SMEs, there could be certain special treatment or preferential treatment for the application. We're also seeing interagency committee. So it's no longer just securities SEC or Security Exchange Commission or central bank kind of initiative, but we are seeing inter-advisory committee, where in the case of Malaysia, I think it recently announced that with the approval of the Ministry of Finance, so you have the central bank, the Securities Commission, the stock exchange regulator, the companies commission, audit oversight board, and the financial reporting foundation. So these are real economy kind of regulators. We have companies commission. They're coming together to support the implementation of the ISSB. So I think this is a very interesting development where you have a very coordinated approach, not just financial sector, but also the corporate economy. The other point that I think Diana has mentioned is also on SMEs. We are seeing in the case of, let's say, in Malaysia and also in some other countries that regulators are stepping up initiative to support the SMEs. So some regulators have, or central banks have set up a low carbon transition fund to kind of subsidize the financing costs for SMEs. Some have set up certain working group to raise awareness and also to kind of defray the cost of certification for the case of SMEs. So as we know, SMEs are an important part of the value chain of the economy, and then they are part of the just transition as well. You can't just focus on the bigger boys and neglect the SMEs. The last point I would say is that in WF we have this jargon called financing green and greening finance. So regulation and policy is always seen as greening the finance, but we are also increasingly seeing regulators doing the financing green component, not just from a monetary policy investment portfolio management standpoint, but they are also facilitating the greening of supply chain, how to scale up green technology, and we are seeing they are also integrating the capital market as well. How do you have more sustainable capital market to kind of not just green the finance, but also supporting the financing of the green as well.
Thank you. Maybe on that second point, Diana, and touching especially on transition plans, if we think of the notion that today's impacts might be tomorrow's risks, what do you think the role is of transition plans in sort of helping banks take a more long-term view? And also, is this something that you see your members already beginning to do? Thinking about and in developing transition plans, and what do you think the role of regulation might be in supporting that?
Yes, indeed, transition and transition planning are the new buzzwords. We did realize that before we reach the green, we'll have to transition to it. And this is actually the longest and the more difficult process. We do now know what is green, but if you look at taxonomies, like for example, the European taxonomy, which tells you what is green according to European standards, and if you apply this framework to the economy and the activities in Europe, you see that 3 to 5% of the activities in the economy and the assets will actually fall into the green category, which suggests that the rest of the 95% have to transition somehow there. And this is now the big challenge. And places like, for example, Japan, they started pioneering before all of us, experimenting how this transition can be accomplished by focusing on transition plans for different sectors versus having green taxonomies. And time will be the judge of their experiment. And I see now more kind of including local taxonomies that have transition element. As to your question of whether banks are already doing something and the regulators are doing something in this respect, private sector is always very quick and very flexible to respond to what has been asked to do or what hasn't been yet asked to do but is anticipating to doing so. Every firm tries to anticipate what the regulation will be and to prepare in advance. So I think it's safe to say that we can see more activities doing within the private sector, in our case the banking sector, with respect to transition. If you look at all the major banks, they already have transition plans. Most of the multinational banks have commitments by 2050, and they already put out their plans of how they are going to achieve them, including how they are going to kind of step out of certain brown investments, how they're going to encourage other investments. So the balance of their portfolio is pretty much already lined up. Now the question is whether and how we're going to achieve this. Central banks and regulators are a little bit slower, and that's always the case. Actually, we think regulation leads the market, but very often the market leads the regulation, and that's not a bad thing. There has to be balance between the two. I don't think there's any central bank that has a clear mandate yet to drive transition, and this is for obvious reasons, because transition has to happen across the economy. Financial sector is just an enabler, but ultimately our real economies, our corporates will have to transition, and they are subject to different regulations. They have different supervisory bodies. Different ministries are responsible for their transition. So actually one of the things that it would be very important is to have cross-agency groups that coordinate these efforts, and also to have international groups and dialogues that coordinate this across the board. Because when we're talking about some of the difficult to abate industry, including, for example, aviation, transport, where we actually don't have the technologies yet to fully step out of conventional fuels, you need to think globally, that this is not an issue for just specific jurisdiction. So both coordination among different states within their different stakeholders, and global coordination is super important. And I think in this respect, bodies like UN, NGOs like WWF are super important, because you are the people who take this message across the globe. And as I said at the beginning, I represent mostly multinationals, and for us it's super important that this message goes, and that there is this dialogue and this understanding between different parts of the community.
Thank you. We heard yesterday from my colleague Romy that we cannot achieve this transition and ultimately net zero ambitions without addressing biodiversity. At the same time, evidence is mounting on the potential material financial stability risks stemming from biodiversity loss and other nature-related issues. And we see a number of interesting developments in the region of regulators increasingly thinking both climate and nature. For example, the MAS supervisory guidelines specifically cover climate and environmental risks. So I want to pose a question to both of you, how you expect regulation to address biodiversity in the next few years. Or whether you think this is yet another example of where the market will need to take a first step for regulation to catch up. Maybe you, Adam, first.
Yeah. So the environmental risks safeguards are actually not new. In fact, in the early days, I mean, you have the Equator principle, which is primarily focusing on general environmental safeguards for project finance. But also many financial institutions have been adopting the International Finance Corporation, the IFC performance standards that cuts across pollution, waste, and so on. So therefore, it's not a new thing. It's not a post COP15 kind of a wake-up call. But I think COP15, what it has elevated is in terms of the global targets and scenarios, and the kind of alignment between global standards or targets with regions and localities and so on. So coming to your point on what regulators have done or could do in the future. So we have seen a few countries such as the Netherlands, France, Brazil, Malaysia, and also WF and BCG has also embarked on a study in the case of India. And these are some jurisdictions where they have already done impact and dependency studies to look into using OnCore and a few other methodology but OnCall is a publicly available tool by UNEP, WCMC. And so essentially what they have done is mainly a diagnostic kind of assessment of the real economy at the sectorial level. So which sector which sector where, of course, the exposure of the banks and insurance, which sector are highly dependent on which ecosystem services, and how those impact are being derived. So at least that was one. The second initiative that we are seeing regulators embarking on is to look into more asset level assessment. So in WWF, also in some other organization like SMP, has recently come up with asset level biodiversity or nature risk assessment. So we are expecting financial institution, corporates, and regulators to increasingly use that tool. And last but not least, the third layer or the more advanced tool would be nature scenario analysis. So in fact, McKinsey or Vivid Economics have done a study in the case of Africa to look into this nature-based scenario analysis or stress test. In fact, the NGFS has a working group that looks into scenario building for nature. So these are some of the kind of analytics works that the regulator could do. But on top of that, just like how they have embarked on climate, whether it is commitment level, risk management, prudential regulation, and so on, I think the same could also be mimicked from climate to nature.
Thank you. How do you see this picture evolving, Diana?
This picture is going to be very interesting and has a lot of colors. We're all aware of this, and although there is full understanding that we have to address all environmental challenges, including climate, nature, biodiversity, and pollution and so on, because none of it is just exclusive and the most important without the rest of them. This brings enormous complexity to the whole scenario, and I have to say, looking at the latest developments for TNFD and what would be required to start reporting on nature-related matters, this is going to really require a lot of human and monetary capital to be implemented. So I think one thing that has already started to happen is having respect to these other environmental challenges and objectives within taxonomies, for example. Most of the European taxonomy has the do no significant harm, for example, and many of the local taxonomies that are in development have taken this principle as well. So I think this is a good start and is going to give us a real sense of where we are, how much the different elements of environmental considerations touch and overlap between each other, and how we can target them all in harmony versus just picking up one and harming the rest of them. So I'm very kind of careful with my words here, as you can see, because our members are between excited and terrified of this nature-related challenge. And again, with the full understanding that this has to be addressed together, it's going to be very challenging.
Yeah, I think we can agree on that last part. We have just about 5 more minutes, so I want to make sure I will address any audience questions if there are any. Okay, I'm very happy to keep going because I have way more questions than we have time for. But yeah, given we don't have that much more time, maybe just try to look into the future together, and also for any concluding remarks that you may have. What steps do you think? Where will this journey go? Basically, what steps do you think regulators will be taking in the next 5 years or so to bring the financial sector and by extension the real economy into alignment with global sustainability agendas. And yes, any concluding remarks you may have. Adam, I'll let you go first.
Yeah. So I have 3 points on this. So currently the state of play is pretty much a catch-up game. So either financial institutions are catching up with different standards, different regulations, and so on, or the regulators are also doing the same as well. So that's the current state of play. But I think moving forward, what we could envision is that both financial institutions and regulators and central banks are not playing the catching up game, but they are the standard setter or the pioneers when it comes to certain new initiatives, whether locally or regionally. I think the ASEAN taxonomy is a good example where the ASEAN central banks and regulators are coming together, but it is still considered as a kind of passenger rather than a leader, a driver approach, because I think the EU taxonomy is a good example where people come together and set up. The second point is that I think your point on today's risks is tomorrow's or the future's impact. I think double materiality is something, it remains a very elegant concept, but it's also very true from a philosophical standpoint that it's not just what is the impact from climate to you as a financial institution, but what is your impact and how your actions could affect the biodiversity loss or climate change. I think that this elegant theory hasn't been translated into risk management. In some jurisdictions we have seen that they have such policy. I think EU has double materiality embedded in some of the guidelines, but it's not prevalent across all domains. And then I think the third point is that we do know that central banks and regulators are very much stability focused or risk-based focused, but we also want to see a balance between risk and opportunity. So some of the example that we have given earlier, the low carbon transition fund to support SMEs and so on, which are not so much of a risk-based approach, but more of an enabler and opportunity kind of frontier perspective.
And over to you.
Yes, and just to add, to expand on Adam's kind of referral to risk and opportunities, it's really important actually to strike the balance, because we don't want to paralyze the system because of fear that the risk is too great, and the risk is both monetary but also reputational. We've seen several allegations of greenwashing, which hasn't been mentioned enough here, but it's one of the key considerations our members take into account when they're going to make a decision. So we don't want to push people into hiding, and we don't want to put these regulations just to make them a compliance tick box. We want them to actually drive change versus being just yet another legal obligation that our members, our financial sector will have. So next few years will be critical, and I think it's really a close watch to see how things will develop, and we collectively to help to actually achieve a real change versus just, as I said, something which is going to stay on paper.
I absolutely could not agree more on the last point. We absolutely have to make sure that regulation and policy is fit for purpose in enabling and encouraging a real alignment and a real transition over it becoming about ticking boxes and a compliance exercise. I could not agree more. I think, so at UNEP-FI we like to think of policy and regulation and voluntary action in the market as a sort of dance, right? It's not one has to happen before the other takes over, but it's something that jointly evolves over time with the market taking initiatives like the principles for responsible banking, and then regulation building on that in certain jurisdictions, and then again spearheading change in the industry. And I think our conversation this morning confirms that important developments are taking place, but that at the same time, there are areas to improve on to make sure that that regulation is fit for purpose. So with that, I thank you very much for joining me this morning, and thank you to all of you for your attention.